Hi there, class. In this instructional video, I'll be talking about how to respond to criticism when received and also how to deliver bad news in business situations. Both of these are really common in what we would call real-world business places, and so I imagine many of you have even had some experience with these yourself. It does take a little bit of time, and it is undoubtedly pretty uncomfortable when these situations come up. But the good news is there are a number of strategies to help us get through it effectively. So in this video, I've got three main topics that I'll cover. First of all, we'll look at what this assignment calls for and the basic structure. I'll say there's no surprises. You'll just be writing a one-page, roughly, business letter in which you respond to some hypothetical criticism. Talk a little bit about some strategies for critical feedback, both how you can receive it if you're getting that kind of feedback and it's harsh, but also how you can give someone else feedback, especially if you need to let them know something that's not going well, how to kind of just get to the point and not sugarcoat things. And then in the third part of this video, we'll talk about some things at the level of tactics. So there's a number of different things you can consider here as far as indirect or direct approaches to communicating difficult topics, as well as how to frame subjects in different ways so that your reader or listener might hear it or interpret it in a positive way or be more receptive to the message. And then finally, some different strategies for using buffer language if you think it's appropriate to the situation. To open, I do want to just share that this is something that business leaders talk about fairly frequently, and in a recent, which would be April 20th of 2023, there was a news article with an interview. The CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, talked a little bit about criticism and how for him, he says he would not be able to function without criticism. And that's a little bit interesting because for most people, it's something that we tend to avoid. But he actually says when he receives it, the number one thing is I try very hard not to take things personal that I don't think are meant to be personal. And then to paraphrase, he goes on to say he takes that criticism and uses it really to improve his work process. I'll be sure to include a link to an accessible copy of this news article on Canvas if you want to read the full thing for detail. But this is just one testimony really about the ways you can approach criticism in terms of receiving it so that you can use it to your advantage. So this assignment basically is giving you the opportunity to do that in a really kind of controlled way. And because it's responding to this hypothetical situation, hopefully it takes some of that personal pressure off of actually receiving real criticism. So I'll just read through the scenario as this, that for the last year or so, you've been working hard to meet your goals within the business that you're working at, and everything seems to be going well. You're meeting your targets. Everything around you, your team seems to be in good high spirits, but then something happens where your boss sends you an email and the boss is expressing disappointment. At least that's how you hear the tone coming across in the email. The boss points out that you've been late a few times to work, that your overtime seems to be excessive, and that you have some projects that are unfinished. And so despite everything that's been going on, and although it feels like it's going well for you, it does seem like your manager has got some things that they want you to address. So the assignment is respond to those critical points in a way that's professional and not off-putting, and also acknowledges what the boss is explaining and recognizing they might have some reason for approaching you with this. So the goals are here. Write a formal letter, and I'm going to emphasize this is a formal business letter. This is not an email, even though that's what you received in the hypothetical, and this is also not a memo. We've been practicing those other genres of writing. For this one, your assignment should be a formal letter. You're going to respond to the boss's complaints, and then if you need to look at the rubric, I would encourage you to do that to get some guidance, but these are the things that you're going to want to include. It does not necessarily need to be in this order. So you're going to want to have an acknowledgement. Let them know that you've received their complaints and basically repeat what those complaints are to indicate to them that you understand what they have brought to your attention. Acknowledge that there's some dissatisfaction. clarify any kinds of questions or confusion you might have. There is some latitude as far as you being able to bring in these details into the story, and then move in to kind of have a forward-looking view and say, here's what I'm going to do moving forward to address these issues that you've brought up. And then you can always ask for suggestions as well. I think I might try to do this instead of the way I've been doing it. Does that sound good to you? Or do you think there's another way? If possible, end on a positive note, or I would say at least write your letter in such a way that you keep the conversation open, that your manager could receive your letter and feel like they could probably have a response and continue the conversation rather than just closing things off, like in a state of denial or something like that. So a couple of things here to think about in this letter. One thing you can try to do is think about removing the ouch factor, I would call it, or what some of our readings have called the sting. Anytime we receive criticism, it hurts in a way that's really different than, say, getting praise for something you've done well. And so it can help to separate that kind of like personal or emotional response from the actual content of the critical message itself. And that way you can focus your response to the critical message and not so much the sting or all of the other parts that are there. Definitely do work, though, to acknowledge all of the critical points that are made. I think where these letters can sometimes fall through, the response letter, is if you just don't acknowledge the point that your boss brought up in the first place, or you're not really taking the time or demonstrating the effort to listen or pay attention to what the other person has said. Be really careful about minimalizing or trivializing anything that is brought up. So in other words, in this example, if your boss is bringing up your overtime as being excessive and says that's a problem, to minimize it would be to say, hey, it's actually not that big of a deal because I know that our company has a big budget. So what does it matter if I have a few extra hours of overtime? Don't do that. Don't make the complaint smaller. That's going to actually be a little bit insulting to the person who brought it up to your attention. So acknowledge it in its fullness. And then you'll get to choose. This really depends on your communication style. Do you want to be really direct, or would you rather take a more indirect approach? In a minute or so, I'll share some different strategies for how to do that. A lot of this depends, number one, on your personality and your comfort level, and number two, on the person you're communicating with and what you think that they're expecting and are going to be most responsive to. So, the final piece I'll say here is that you can use buffering if it seems appropriate. I think a more productive or generative approach usually is to ask questions or seek clarity instead of making assertions or making declarations. So don't close the conversation down. Instead, try to open the conversation up, and that will allow for more dialogue and less of the kind of finger pointing and getting closed off. I'll emphasize again, the format for writing is a business letter. We've talked about these before. If you need to think back to previous examples where we've used a business letter, I'll point out at the beginning of the semester, we did the revising a letter for objectivity, which was actually a fairly close and similar assignment to this one. Of course, in this one, you're writing the letter yourself instead of just revising one that's already there. But think about what kind of format you used for that letter. And similarly, think about the cover letter that you wrote whenever you were preparing your professional documents to go along with your resume and LinkedIn profile. A business letter is going to need to have addresses both for yourself and for the recipient. In this case, go ahead and make them up. You do not need to use your actual address, but practice using this format because it is expected in formal business writing. Also include the date, and then include a salutation. In this case, it would be dear, and then whoever the manager or boss is. Dear and sincerely are going to always be the safest options for a formal letter. Do be sure to use paragraph breaks. You can see, without even focusing on the words on this sample letter, that the paragraphs are short, typically 1, 2, or 3 sentences long. Those short paragraphs help you to organize your message and then break up the parts that you're trying to communicate into easier to digest segments. I'll shift here a little bit to say if that's what the overall assignment involves, some other things you can think about and maybe even apply in the peer review session for this assignment can be seen in Leon Renninger's TED Talk, which is posted in Canvas, about the secret to giving good feedback. I really like the points that she makes here, and I've reproduced them here in this single slide so they're easy to reference. I'll just share, she talks about the micro yes, asking somebody to engage with communication in a way that's really easy. Do you have 5 minutes to talk with me about something? I'd like to share some ideas with you. Is now a good time? Get that initial piece. We don't need that so much for peer response because ours is a little bit structured, but in a workplace that might work really well. Or even in a personal context that could work well also. Data points can be really helpful, especially in a business place. For our example, if you're talking about arriving late, you might look back at all the days that you came to work and what days did you arrive on time or early and how many days did you arrive late, and you can give a specific number. Renninger here advises against using blur words, which we might call buffer elsewhere. That's ultimately up to you, but data specific can offer really good anchor points for talking rather than just kind of ambiguous statements about what we think is going on or how our intention toward work has been going. The third one here is the impact. Thinking really, how does this information impact me? For this case, how does this information impact the manager and the business? And if you can state a little bit about what you think the impact is, it allows you to recognize that all of these choices and behaviors have broader consequences than just for ourselves. And so again, this is going to open up the conversation with others rather than close things down and just be declaration. And finally, the fourth point that she brings up is this question, checking in with the other person. This works out differently in a conversation because you can do it in real time and say, well, what do you think about that? Or how do you see the situation? And then the other person can respond. But in a written type of communication, you can still take the same move. And if you think about it, if you include a phrase like, what do you think about my decision to leave home and come to work 10 minutes early to avoid being late for work, would that work for you? That gives the person reading your letter a chance to think about it and respond to you if they want. Again, it's opening up the conversation. So just a kind of question, food for thought at this point is, since we've done different types of writing for this class, you might ask yourself, which is easier or more difficult for you? Asking somebody for something that you need or want, so pitching a request, or giving critical feedback, like we're doing in this assignment, or accepting critical feedback. To wrap this video up, I'll share a number of different strategies here. I don't think there's any of them that are right or wrong in all cases. These are really just communication tools. It's up to you to figure out if they're going to be useful for you given the situation. And so we'll start with two different approaches in business communication for handling bad news or criticism or other kinds of difficult communication that we generally wouldn't want to have. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have what would be considered a direct approach, and that just leads right in with the bad news right off the bat. If you've ever, for example, received an email letting you know that you weren't selected for some job or you weren't selected for an award or you didn't get admitted to some program that you wanted to do, a direct approach would say it in the very first sentence. I'm sorry to let you know that you were not selected for this position. And then it would go on to provide the reasons. Maybe there was a lot of competition and we only had 2 spots, but we had 100 applicants. A little bit more information. If they want to put a positive angle or a positive spin, I'll talk in a second about framing is what we could call that. And then closing it at the end. Thank you so much for considering us. We hope you'll consider us again in the future. Sincerely, your name. That's the direct approach. That will work with some people. The indirect approach, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, might be more appropriate. It's up to you to decide which one you prefer. The idea with the indirect approach is that we don't want to just hit somebody with bad news right off the bat with no real warning. So you might open with something like a buffer. We don't have any buffer in the direct approach. So the buffer might be like, It's been really nice to have you working at our company for the last year. We appreciate all the effort that you've been doing, and you've made all these great contributions. Give your next reasons. We've noticed some things happening around the office where it seems like you're not getting all the projects you've said done. I'm actually being fairly direct right now, but still nonetheless trying to take this indirect approach. You don't actually deliver the bad news until halfway or 2/3 of the way into the letter, at which point you would say something like, we have noticed all of these behaviors that are problematic and we need you to change them. Otherwise, we're going to need to do a behavioral improvement plan, or you might possibly be let go from the company. And then you can close it out respectfully. We appreciate your service to the company and hope that we can rectify the situation. Sincerely, your name. In both cases, the idea is you're going to still communicate the bad news. There's no way of getting around delivering the bad news or offering up the criticism. You just have to do it. It's a question of when do you do it and how do you frame it within other kinds of information so that the person receiving the information might be a little bit more responsive or receptive to it. And that's where framing can come in. I'm not going to necessarily read through all of these examples, but the idea here for pretty much anything we want to communicate, there's more than one way to communicate it. And if you have the chance to pause and think through some of the different ways you can say something or the different ways you could write something you might notice is that different ways might have a more negative connotation or a more positive connotation. In these examples, I'll just say, for example, the first one, your request doesn't make any sense. Or if you're responding in this case for the class assignment, dear manager, what you've just said, I think sounds like a lie to me. Really negative and is not going to be received well. You can think about on the right-hand side a way to positively frame it. Instead of your request doesn't make sense, you could say, please clarify your request. And instead of calling your boss a liar, you could say, I'm not really sure that we're seeing the facts in the same way. Can you tell me a little bit about what you've observed that's causing this concern? And then you can see there's a number of other examples here. Framing really doesn't change, again, the essence of what we're saying. It just changes how we're saying it and how the person receiving the message might be able or willing to receive it. And so the final kind of tool that I'll share, buffer language, there is a little bit of debate in business communication as to if or when this would be appropriate. I will say some of this could be cultural. Some cultures tend to be very direct. European and dominant Anglo-American discourse in business tends to be very direct and avoid buffer language. Other cultures, say for example in East Asia, I've got some personal experience with this, might actually prefer and value some buffer language. Buffer language is going to be words or communication that we put around the main piece that we're asking or informing someone about to make it easier for them to accept that information. Buffer language by its nature is typically going to accompany indirect approaches to delivering bad news. And so these are some of the options you can use. Find something that you agree on to start out. Find an agreement point and then work from there. We both agree that I've been working for this company for the last year and I've been putting in a lot of effort. You can always appreciate, this one goes a long way. Thank you so much for bringing this to my attention. I realize this is a concern for you and it's really something that I value, and thank you for letting me know about. The ethos of cooperation. Let's work together to try to find a solution. I know this is a problem, but I am confident that if we are both willing to find common ground, cooperation, we can move forward together. Fairness can, as we say here, express your commitment to do something that you've already said you're going to do if you had a previous agreement. So in all fairness, let's go back to the last time we talked about this. We agreed that I was gonna, be able to work remotely 2 out of the 5 days of the week or whatever. Starting with good news or putting the positive spin. Oftentimes it's starting with good news or ending with good news. You might have heard of things even like the compliment sandwich, where you use good news on both sides of the bad message. Praise can work well if it's actually a genuine compliment. Be really careful, though, about overdoing praise because you can sound disingenuous. Or in the case of someone where you're having to give them bad news, you might give them a false sense of hope, which is the last thing you want to do because then they'll be crushed when they get the actual news. And then finally here, understanding can be helpful. It does go hand in hand with cooperation. We're trying to have a common understanding. You can also use this, though, as a point to say, I recognize that we might not see certain things the same way, and you can point out what those could be. Those are just a few approaches of using buffer language. And I'll close this out, I guess, with 3 little points that I like to think of when I think through difficult kinds of business communication. First of all, consider your reader. Now more than ever, you've probably been hearing this throughout the course. Think about the reader, think about the audience, but in this case, it's so important. The image here on the screen showing 2 people attempting to talk to each other. One has this really nice, even concentric circle kind of spiral going on in their head. And then as it transmits to the other person, it's just a jumbled mess. We can think that the other person is understanding us the way we want to be understood, but oftentimes the difficulty arises because we are really not understanding each other and what the other person is communicating or needing. So to that end, try to be generous and give other people the benefit of the doubt. If you approach the situation as kind of like hostile or adversary, it's going to make it so that you're trying to find conflict. And if you try to find conflict, it's very easy to find it or create it. Instead, give things a switch. Try to assume that the other person is actually wanting to work with you. They're actually trying to do something to be helpful or find some resolution to a problem, and go from there. It might not always be the case, but try starting from there instead of maybe starting from other places. And finally, I'll just say it is at the end of all of this important and up to you to be direct as you can be. And I say that recognizing that for sometimes a lot of us, indirect communication is actually going to be more direct than not saying anything at all. But it's important for you to be able to advocate for yourself, because at best you might have allies helping you, but in most cases it really is going to be up to you to be doing that work. So I hope this is good practice and can provide you with some skills moving forward, not just in this class, but into your professional lives and beyond.